Okay, we're loading that.
It's our Jewish house on our Chicago campus. At Everett Center, we provide an opportunity to explore all kinds of Jewish subjects: food, music, politics, history, comedy, literature, and so on. In a time of rising anti-Semitism, the center offers a safe space for learning, discussion, and a debate of important issues for both Jews and our wider Chicago community. Now, in its 17th year, the center was made possible by Edith Everett in memory of her husband, Henry. She envisioned a welcoming Jewish denominational house with free programming and guest rooms, and that vision has flourished. We host 2 to 3 talks each week, along with Jewish-themed films on Sundays and Wednesdays. This week's schedule at Everett includes Tuesday at 12:30, Mr. Bernstein will be interviewed by Mr. Joe Camper. Wednesday at 12:30, a talk about musical humorist Alan Sherman. Wednesday at 3:30, another showing of the Israeli comedy Matchmaker 2. This week's program is generously sponsored by Saul Ludwig, and can we give him a hand? Today's talk will last about 45 minutes, and then we have 15 minutes left for questions. Right now, please make sure your cell phone is on silent. I would like to introduce David Bernstein, who is a passionate advocate of the free expression of ideas and the state of Israel. He founded the North American Values Institute, which opposes radical ideologies and supports liberal values in and out of the Jewish community. He is the author of Woke Anti-Semitism: How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. David Bernstein is also co-founder of the Institute for Liberal Values, a consortium of like-minded organizations supporting liberal principles. He is past president and CEO of Jewish Council for Public Affairs and former executive director of the David Project. He spent 13 years at the American Jewish Committee in senior roles. He is a fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy and a strategic advisor for the Combat Anti-Semitism movement. Mr. Bernstein is a prolific speaker, podcaster, and writer, having written hundreds of opinion pieces for the Jewish and general press. And now, please welcome Mr. David Bernstein.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. My wife and I were walking down from the Everett house where we're staying, and it started to rain. And I said to her, "No one's going to show up." Wow, what a great group of people. Bring all the elements. It's really been a pleasure to be here. I've been hearing about Chautauqua Institution my entire adult life. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and I always had Cleveland friends, and there was always somebody from Cleveland who had a family member who would come here, and so, I heard about it, of course, but it's really just beautiful. And when my grandmother said, "What's not to like?" I feel the weight of history being here with the role that Chautauqua has played in the ideas of American society over many decades. So it's really an honor to partake in that. One last word before I get into the crux of that. Some of the topics that I raise are controversial. And, this is a place of ideas, so I know we're not unused to controversial ideas. There's a phrase in Judaism called Machlokes Hashem Shemayim, arguments for the sake of heaven. And so whatever I bring to you is an argument for the sake of heaven. I invite you to challenge it, to question it, to think differently than I do. And so I wanted to offer that in the spirit of discussion. This wasn't even debate. So, October 9, 2023, 31 student groups at Harvard condemned Israel for the massacre that had just been committed against Israeli citizens. How many of you were surprised when you heard that student group? Yeah. How many of you were surprised by these college encampments that prevented Jewish students from going to class, or to the library? How many of you were surprised by that? Yeah. We're going to return to that in a minute, but I want to just take a momentary digression. A few months ago, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, issued a report on its inquiry into what happened on October 2nd. The IDF failed in its mission to protect civilians, was the conclusion. You might recall that there were these young female soldiers that were on these lookout posts that were warning their superiors for weeks that something strange was going on. They were seeing these exact scaled models of the observer positions just like the one they were on. And they were seeing military exercises around them, yet no one took what they said seriously. Crazy. I mean, this is, by the way, the same idea, the same Mossad, the same Israeli intelligence that just planted a manufacturing of drone operation into Iran. The same Israeli intelligence that conducted the pager operation, that they couldn't understand what was happening just a few miles away, what their female Israeli soldiers were telling them. And one of the things that they found in this report, and you've been hearing a lot about, is called the concepcia. The concepcia means like a concept, or it's sort of like the group thing around this. In other words, the Israelis that were in charge of the IDF and the intelligence services believed that Hamas wasn't going to do what they did. They were certain of it. So they filtered all the news that they got from various sources through that concepcia. And my question is, why were we, American Jews, and others who might be here who care, why were we surprised by what happened on October 8th, and 9th, and 10th, and continues to happen on college campuses, in K-12 spaces, in nonprofit organizations? Why were we surprised? What concepcia might we have had that made us think that this kind of radicalism that we've seen in the past 2 years, almost 2 years, wasn't really already afoot? I mean, there's no way what we saw on October 9th at Harvard hadn't been building from something. And we spent millions of dollars on our organizations I've worked for, organizations that I continue to love and feel connected to, and they didn't warn us. What went wrong? Why? And where is our internal inquiry? The IDF conducted internal inquiry. I haven't yet to hear about Jewish organizations saying, where did we get wrong? What weren't we paying attention to? In conducting this, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to conduct the probe, okay, for you. What would be better for committee people, it would be better for some organizations that didn't warn us were part of that probe, but they're not. And so I'm going to do it here. And I think I have a little standing because I wrote a book 1 year before, that came out 1 year before October 7th, October 2022, that basically said there's a radical ideology that is fueling anti-Semitism and is causing real problems in our Jewish communities as they do. So I think I've got some standing to make this point. And, I went back and I read a little bit more about this IDF probe that I wanted to inform my probe here today. An Israeli official, a top person, said, this isn't about finding a scapegoat or assigning blame. It's about understanding the systemic vulnerabilities that allow this to happen, ensuring we're better prepared for the future. It's an opportunity to strengthen our operations and to foster a culture of continuous improvement and adaptability. So I want us to ask, what did we miss? What do we have to inquire about? And how do we have to change to make sure that we're not subject to these kind of internal fallacies in conception? So what's my first finding number one? And this one's the most controversial, just start right there. After the George Floyd incident, the great racial reckoning, many of us just thought that racial reckoning was just about police violence and brutality. We saw somebody who was abused and murdered. We had every right, people had every right to be upset about that, and to respond to that, and to ask ourselves some very tough questions about our policing and about our society. But what we didn't understand is embedded in the post-George Floyd reckoning was a radical ideology that was shared by many of the core activists, and that many institutions after George Floyd were under pressure to adopt this ideology. Now, what is this ideology? What am I talking about? Now, my book uses the W word, woke. And it's a provocative term. Read this on books, it's a provocative term. And you don't have to use that. But I want to define what I'm talking about, and I'll talk wherever you want. The ideology that we're talking about divides people neatly into these binaries of oppressed versus oppressor. And it looks at any group that's sort of below the economic average as being oppressed, and any group that's on average above the economic average, or the average educational achievement, let's say, as being oppressors. Because according to this ideology, the only way one group can do better than another is because they're oppressing them. Otherwise, everybody will do the exact same. Now, where do you think that puts Jews? I have a friend who heads up the Hindu American Alliance. Hindus actually do better on average than Jews in their society. They're number one in economic achievement, number one in average educational achievement, and yet, and she's feeling this acutely as well. And she's worried that it's having an impact on her community, not to the same extent to the Jewish community, but certainly to a large extent. So what we started to see after October 7th were tremendous pressure on institutions to buy into this, what was then sometimes called anti-racist ideology. Now, I'm an anti-racist. I'm against racism. Of course I'm an anti-racist. But the definition of anti-racism was not just being against racism. It was an entire ideology that divided people into these simplistic binaries. And institutions were under heavy pressure to buy into them. You had Edward Kennedy's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. But it wasn't just about opposing racism. It made demands on people that if you weren't signed up to his ideology in the whole, then you were racist. So people started to cave. They started to not ask questions. Even Jewish organizations that would debate into the wee hours of the night, every single I and every single T in its policy statements, just simply bought into it. And when I was working for the organized mission committee at that time, I would raise questions. Are we really going to accept this definition of this word equity as it's being presented? I used to think of equity as like equality, right? Equality of opportunity. But this definition of equity was that unless groups will achieve parity, then it meant one group was oppressing the other. That was what was being smuggled in anti-racism. And we didn't understand what was happening. And all kinds of organizations then came out with new public statements and bought into this and empowered people and organizations to make decisions for them. And I think we inadvertently ended up supporting some of the very ideological tenets that then fueled anti-Semitism. Finding number 2. we really didn't take anti-Semitism on the last series. When we thought of anti-Semitism, we thought about, dudes with swastika tattoos on their arms. We thought about people screaming all kinds of obscenities. We thought about the people that I grew up with in Columbus, Ohio in the 1970s who, would throw a coin at me in the hallway, or wrote a swastika in my book and laugh. That was what I called anti-Semitism too growing up. That was the anti-Semitism that we knew well. We knew that anti-Semitism. It's been around for thousands of years. But we really had trouble getting our head around that being anti-Semitism. It was very different. It didn't come in the form of swastika tattoos. It came in the form of, like, professors sometimes. It came in the form of campus protests. It came in the form of teachers' unions that I'll talk about particularly tomorrow. We were pushing an ideology out and holding Israel in complete contempt and not even allowing the conversation to happen in the schools. It looked very different, and we didn't recognize it. And, we used to say, prior to I represented, and I have to say, I think I was guilty of this too. Anti-Semitism on the right is like a hurricane. It hits you hard. It's like what happened in Squirrel Hill. It's murderous in nature. And anti-Semitism on the left is like climate change. It's slow-moving. It's corrosive in nature. But what I tried to argue in my book is something that might, like climate change, that might be slow-moving and corrosive, might emerge as like a hurricane down the line. And what we see since October 7th is a tsunami of anti-Semitism on the left. People justifying globalizing intifada. We didn't see it coming because it was a little bit more like climate change, and not like the kind of anti-Semitism that we knew well. Finding number 3, we ignored academia. Now, I have to tell you, I've had so many conversations about this. Look, these academic trends were around when I was in college, and I'm 58 years old. And 40 years ago, you could see these academic trends catching on. You could go to a certain ethnic studies class at your university and not be able to talk because the professor had all the answers. And we thought, what's the problem here? What do you care if some Michigan professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz teaches this crazy stuff? The kids, they'll take it maybe for a couple of years, they'll be a little radical, they'll settle down, it won't spread. We didn't believe that what was being taught in college classrooms, A, a significant percent of the kids were actually going to believe, B, when they graduated from college, they were going to take it with them into the workplace, and C, it was going to jump the ladder out of universities, out of higher education, to the broader streams of society. It was going to not just stay in the humanities department at Brown, it was going to be in the K-12 schools, where every kid goes to. And we were going to be dealing with it in ways that we just weren't used to, didn't understand. Because we didn't understand the power of ideas. And I have to tell you, I talked to a lot of philanthropists, and some of them were like, okay, what's really behind all this stuff? I said, well, it's pretty complicated. It's really the guitarist, right? The guitar guy. I said, it's one factor, yeah. I said, you got to pay attention to the radical ideology that's been brewing in universities for over 60 years. No, they want to dismiss that because you got to follow the money, right? You want to follow the money. And they're not wrong. You got to follow the money. But the money doesn't tell you the entire story. This is a homegrown ideology. Homegrown, right here. And it's our kids, successive generations of people have been exposed to this. So we have to understand that what happens in the university doesn't stay in the university. Finding number 4. We thought that our so-called allies would stick with us. So let me tell you a little story. December 2023, 2 months after all this happened, I was invited to speak in South Florida to a mainstream Jewish organization. And the guy who invited me, this is a friend of mine, known for many years, said, "David, just be careful about what you say." He was worried that I was going to criticize the diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI. I think a lot of this ideology that we're talking about is embedded in DEI. Not all DEI, diversity is a wonderful thing, by the way. Including people is a wonderful thing. Recruiting people to make sure you have a diverse board is a wonderful thing. But again, these are Trojan horses for something much more aggressive and much more illiberal than that. So my friend was worried that I might alienate people. And what it really came down to is he was worried about one person, mostly one person. This very high caliber who'd been involved in progressive causes in our community for decades. So we get to the lunch, and I give my spiel. And when I'm done, we start doing Q&A. We're going around the table. And every single person around that table says, "You know what, you're right, I didn't see it. You're right, it's radical ideology. And now I see now what I didn't see before." These are all what Rev. Stevens would call October 8 Jews. They woke up to this reality after October 7th. And finally, we get to the woman who everybody was worried about. You could almost hear a pin drop in the room. And she said, "I don't know who I am anymore. I thought that these people that I've been working with for years were my friends. And when this happened, none of them consoled me. In fact, several of these people that I thought were my friends who I worked with in campaigns, I worked with on all kinds of social justice issues, denied that Israeli women were raped on October 7th. They were adamant about it. Those were my allies. Those are the people that the organization I'm here to support have been cultivating for decades. And they weren't there for us. She was stunned. She was experiencing a kind of political social identity crisis. And so we have to ask ourselves, okay, what does that mean for us? If the allies that we thought we had weren't really our friends, then who are our friends? Who can we count on? And I would argue that we have to look at it a little differently than Jewish now. I spent my entire career building the same allies that you have. I'm not a right-winger. I've been part of center-right Jewish causes my entire career. And I was active in the civil rights groups of my generation. And I started more than 20 years ago, and there's a passage in my book I was doing. I wrote a memo in March of 2001 to my colleagues at the American Jewish Committee where I worked on. As a young, something like 30-ish-year-old person. And this is 24 years ago. And I was reporting to them what I was seeing in civil rights cases. So I'm just going to read a little bit from this. In its more radical form, multiculturalism is not really neutral toward American values. It is openly hostile. Some ideologues go beyond claims of discrimination and make the case that racism is deeply embedded in the American value system itself. In order to dismantle this systemic racism, they assert, a state must be driven through the hegemony of American cultural norms. Echoes of this can, unfortunately, be heard even among some of our partners in the civil rights community. Inasmuch as AJC seeks to preserve a common set of American values, we must contest this effort to eradicate them. It is my view that we at AJC sometimes become inadvertent accomplices to a flawed multicultural discourse, and that we should carefully consider the messages that we give to other minorities, especially new immigrants, in our various encounters. So, I was seeing it more than 20 years ago. This was the seeds of it. And that doesn't mean that everybody in the civil rights community that I work with is being this, no, not at all. But they embraced an ideology, an oppressor ideology, that would be used by really bad people in a way that would stifle discourse, that would prevent debate, that would make it tough to talk about issues that needed to be vetted in our society, and it ultimately fueled resentment toward people who were considered to be more economically or educationally successful. And we helped lay the seeds for that because we weren't paying attention. Well, we didn't want to believe it. We didn't want to believe it 25 years ago, and we didn't want to believe it just a few years ago when this was happening. Until we had no choice to believe it on October 8th. Finding number 5. We allowed internal critics to be shut down. Now, I have to tell you, I'm one of the people who faced some pretty harsh words after I came out publicly and said, I left my last job, and I wrote some opinion pieces saying, guys, now that I can say it, I'm going to say it. We've allowed a radical discourse to set into our society, and we didn't do testing. There were people, I wasn't the only one, who saw it very right, who left the New York Times because of it. I'm going to read you her words. Every time we pressed on one of the newly mass-embraced policy proposals or narratives, intersectionality, decolonization studies, the Iran nuclear deal, Russiagate, Black Lives Matter, the Women's March, critical race theory, COVID lockdowns, and what do you think would happen? The idea itself fell apart at the seams within seconds of contact with reality. And yet its defenders got more sure of themselves, more performatively boastful, more passionate and gleeful about smearing anyone who dared to question them. And among these defenders were people in the Jewish community. I remember a guy who was friendly with Irish Chester. I don't know if you know the name. Irish Chester is a Jewish demographer out of Florida who does those population surveys in Jewish communities. So when Cleveland wants to know how many Jews are in Cleveland today, where are the trains, where do they live, they bring in Ira and they bring in his partner. And he goes in and he makes a lot of phone calls, and he does emails, and he meets with groups, and then he comes and when all said, he said 85,000 Jews. I don't know if that's the population, we're accountable, but that's what he does. And Ira responded to a study that came out. And the study held that Jews of color were 15% of the American Jewish community. That was a demographer. He's not a philosopher. He wouldn't have him here. He's very smart. And Ira wrote an article with his partner, Arnold Shesky. And he said, excuse me, but the number that the 15% Jews of color just can't be right. It was just a survey done by Pew study 2008, and it showed there was something like 5% or 6%. So how could that be right? That's not right. And I have to tell you, there was an uprising against it. An intifada, if you will, against it. And there was a petition that was signed by 2,500 prominent Jews condemning Ira for doing social science. Some people that I respect and respected then accused him of white intellectualism. They had the reform movement. Somebody I did highly of, I know him, made these comments. And I couldn't believe it was happening. So we shut down our internal critics. We couldn't even talk about it ourselves. So of course we were blind to what was happening because we couldn't talk about radical ideology. And we even shut down our own people who were telling us that something was amiss. Finding number 6. Many, but not all, Jewish organizations still haven't pivoted. A few years ago, and I'm not here to gaze, these are organizations that I've worked on all day. They mean well, they're doing some excellent work. I'm not here to criticize. I'm just saying that they haven't pivoted the way that I think that they should, the way that I still hope they will. In 2001, California adopted a curriculum you might have heard called ethnic studies. Now, to the most Jewish people in ethnic studies, say, ethnic studies, let's learn about the cultures and everybody. I want my kids to learn about the African American Project and Asian Americans. How many are there? Where do the Hispanics in my state live? And who are they? What are the various breakouts of countries they come from? Of course we should learn about that. But that's not what ethnic studies was. Ethnic studies was the study of power and oppression. And it was written into the guidelines of how to teach ethnic studies, and that's what it was. It's about critical consciousness. What is critical consciousness? It's not like critical thinking. It's the opposite of critical thinking. It says that we're going to teach students to learn to see the systems of oppression that abound in our society. In other words, it was meant to shut down critical discourse and open discourse, not to elevate it. And of course, what do you think is going to happen when you teach that? Do you think Israel is going to be portrayed as one of the good guys? I mean, seriously, like the Jewish organizations, when many of them got on board with ethnic studies because they wanted to just get rid of the most anti-Semitic aspects of it. In the early phases of it was explicit. And so they said, okay, we don't want to fight this uphill battle against ethnic studies altogether. We'll just fight against the very explicit anti-Semitic manifestations of Israel. And they fought, and they tried to get out, and they were mostly successful. But what was left in the curriculum was this oppressor ideology. And a lot of school districts in California didn't worry about how Jews were portrayed. They taught kids to think in these binary terms, but then would apply it to Jews and Israel naturally, because that's how they've been taught to think. And now you have school district after school district where this is being embraced by some very radical schools. And we're stuck with this because we couldn't pivot. We couldn't understand what was happening. And even today, some of the same organizations continue to try to say, well, that's okay after studies as long as it doesn't talk about Jews. And there's still, these same organizations are still cultivating the same idea, the same partners, the same coalition partners that they've always worked with. And they have a lot of good reasons to. And they'll tell you, well, we need to do this because we're going to alienate this group when we don't. And that's fine. But what about finding the new people? What about finding the people like my friend at the Hindu American Foundation, who also is the same boat we are? She doesn't fit the bill. She wasn't part of the sort of rainbow coalition of organizations that we worked with previously. But she sees the problem in the same way that many of us ought to see it. What about her? Why aren't we finding those new allies? Why aren't we cultivating them? And as we've seen diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and many of people have seen them, if you ask the mainstream organizations who I'm offering to teach you about diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, we'll say, a lot of these DEI programs that we're seeing in colleges, and in K-12 education, even in law firms and medical societies and life, are really radical. They say very quietly. They're really radical. And I said, well, what are you going to do about it? I have a friend of mine who heads up a mainstream Jewish organization, and I was telling him about a meeting that I had with a group of Jewish teachers in my area. And we were talking about anti-Semitism. That's what we're going to talk about. What are you seeing in schools? And I said, well, what are you seeing in DEI about it? I'm curious. And they said, oh, you're not going to believe this. The schools have embraced something called white supremacy culture. Now, what is white supremacy culture? It holds that values like promptness, being on time, or worship of the written word are white supremacy values. White supremacy values. Now, it doesn't say anything about Jews. But imagine what that's how it's teaching kids to think. And I said to the teachers, well, what are you doing about this? We can't do anything. We'll be targeted if we even question this. So I call up my friend, and I tell him what's happening. He says, boy. I said, boy, what? What are you going to do about it? He goes, boy, nothing. I go, why aren't you going to do anything about it? He said, if I do that, then I will become public enemy number one. I live in an area that's almost all blue, that's almost all liberal, and I won't be able to do many things that you think I ought to do, like get security funding for Jewish organizations, or advocate for Jewish mental health services. And I have to say he's not wrong. And that's the predicament that we find ourselves today. That we live in overwhelmingly blue areas. I just did a little bit of comparing. I asked, and I'm not telling anybody that they should live in a red area or vote for red. I'm very nonpartisan myself. I had chat GPT. I said, okay, give me the top largest Jewish communities in the they voted for? Either Trump or Kamala Harris. And every single one of those top 10 Jewish communities voted significantly for Kamala Harris. And so it tells you that not that that's bad or good. It's not bad or good. I'm not saying it's bad or good. I'm saying what it tells you is that one of the areas that demand of us to be a certain way politically, and that is stifling our ability to critique the radical ideology that we see in our communities around the country. So, lastly, what do we plan? Okay. So, all right. Lastly, what do we do about it? First of all, number one, we're going to have to fight the underlying ideology, not just anti-Semitism. In other words, when you see people talking about white supremacy values in your school, whether they talk about the Jews or don't talk about the Jews, we've got to step in. That doesn't lead anywhere good. When you hear about a workplace that's telling people that they should participate in white affinity groups and black affinity groups and Hispanic affinity groups, and if it's voluntary, fine, but if they're dividing up your children in school into these affinity groups and telling the minority kids that if part of this affinity group you're oppressed, and they're telling the white kids that they're the oppressor, that's not going to go well for us. It's not going to go well for us Jews, it's not going to go well for society. We've got to fight that, not just the anti-Semitism, because that's what's fueling the anti-Semitism that we're experiencing post-October. We've got to fight where it's happening. In K-12 schools, that's what my organization, the North American Values Institute, does. We've got to fight it in higher education. We've got to fight it in nonprofit organizations, many of which we're part of. We've got to build, as I said before, new partnerships, new coalition partners, who buy into a certain vision of civic values. Let me just give you one story about successfully here. Now, it's not yet, the one that's in the making. Brandon Johnson was elected mayor of San Francisco a few years ago, if you recall. He was the Democratic Socialists of America candidate being pushed by teachers' unions. And we knew he was a radical. When he finally got elected, the Jewish community in Chicago tried to reach out to him and be nice to him. But almost immediately, it was very apparent that he was extreme. And he came up with this ridiculous funding scheme that would immediately bankrupt schools. And he came up with all kinds of economic proposals, like we recently heard in New York, that were manifestly bad for the city. And then, when the ceasefire resolution came out, he cast the vote that was a one-sided ceasefire resolution on Israel, and cast the vote that made it pass. And that's when the Chicago Jewish community realized something that they hadn't realized before. They were out of power. Not only were they out of power, but anybody who cared about a certain civic vision of Chicago, who cared about people being able to talk to each other, who cared about being able to solve problems, not just accentuate them. All those people are out of power. And they created something called the Common Ground Collective. And they're raising now millions of dollars to help fund alternative candidates so that when elections come next time, they won't be out of power anymore. I hope that your community takes heed as well. Because we've got to have a civic vision that goes beyond just anti-Semitism. We've got to root the battle against anti-Semitism in the American idea itself. Values that we all support. Values like equal for the student, not many one. Values like equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. Values like the free expression of ideas and thought. These are central to how we were raised. These are central to the Chicago institution. And those values are being challenged by radicals on both sides of the political aisle. And we've got to stand up and we've got to find our friends. Our friends are the people who support those values. It's almost July 4th. It's not just about a nice picnic. It's about standing up for the values that have protected America, but also protected us Jews. And so, this is an amazing opportunity for the American Jewish community, not just to follow, but to lead here. Not leading just to fight against anti-Semitism, let's do that. To lead in rebuilding a common civic vision, and to restore the values that we hold dear. Thank you.
come to the podium. There's a microphone, and David will be very happy to take your question.
Well, great speech. I really enjoyed it, and I thought the announcers did it great. Anyway, an organization that I've given money to, ADL, supported pretty vocally BLM, which I consider a pretty bad organization. They sent me an email recently asking for money, and I sent them an email back saying, all that's going on right now, can you refocus? And are you now an organization that's focused on Jewish issues? We have no problems, we don't need to worry about the BLM problems and stuff like that. And they wrote back and said, oh, we focus more, but we're still supporting them. In your opinion, is it worth still fighting them? Is the good outweighing the bad? What do you feel about that? I don't know.
Look, I had an internship when I was in graduate school at the ADL. I worked with professionals at the ADL my whole life. I have enormous respect for them. I actually have enormous respect for Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO, as well. I think that Jonathan didn't understand what his own organization was doing before I was 7, in some ways, in some realm. My colleague and I, when we did Dr. Bernstein, he's a Black Jewish woman who is really one of the most outspoken advocates for Jewish concerns on these issues in the United States. She and I wrote an opinion sort of taking the ADL path. This was before October 7th. And we said, look, the ADL is buying into these radical ideas, like this idea that racism equals prejudice plus power. That's something that's going on. That's a radical idea. We shouldn't be anywhere near that vision. We should be opposing that vision. And the ADL, in its effort to sort of remain in the good graces of progressive groups, supported BLM, supported those kind of definitions. I would say that Jonathan himself has pivoted in major ways since October 7th. And if you hear, my mom called me, I just heard Jonathan Greenblatt on CNBC, and it sounds like you. And I said, yeah, he really has made some changes in direction, which is great to see. But look, I know this is, I'm just going to say what I think, right? I'm not saying the right thing, so for many years I didn't say the right thing, so now I'm here. So I think the ADL is an organization in some ways is at war with itself. In other words, there's a branch of the ADL that is maybe no longer as strong as it once was, that are pushing radical education programs and the like. And there's another branch that's sort of more firmly implanted in Jewish particularistic interests that saw the writing on the wall about October 7th. That's Jonathan's main activity. He probably doesn't want to lose the entire education and civil rights branch of the organization. And so that's what I think the organization is. It's up to you who you support financially, but that's what I think the organization is. I think it's a work in progress. And I'm curious to see where it ends up in another year or two or 3. Thank you.
Hi. Well, Mr. Barbara, and I'm so glad you're here, and thank you to those who brought you here. So I am from Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is like ground zero for everything you just talked about, including the public schools, including my workplace, which is including university. And I felt very alone in what you're saying is exactly what I was feeling, and it was very hard being in my own congregation, which was not as you can imagine, because like that would be. So my question is this, I actually have 2 questions. This one is the harder one, the other one's going to be easy. I agree that we should take action, but who is the we and how do we do it? So the gentleman before mentioned the ADL, which is a very obvious national organization. So, I don't want to be a little voice. I want to be something as far as where do we take, if we're willing to do something, where is that? And the second question is, where can we buy your book that's not on Amazon?
Tomorrow, by the way, you can buy some.
Is it here?
I have a few tomorrow. So,
David, could you face the mic?
Can you face the mic?
Okay, sorry about that. It's been my upbringing.
So who was the we? The legacy organizations have legacy commitments. Right? It's like, car dealerships. They've been around a long time. They have these contracts with car companies, and they can't do anything but do what they've always done for years. They're locked in, and there's some good reasons sometimes they're locked in. Are some of them going to pivot the way I hope? Maybe, but a lot of them probably won't because they have other things to do. They're trying, for example, to get security funding from the state, local, national government for Jewish agencies. They don't want to alienate anyone. So who's the lead? There are a lot of organizations like mine, and we're not the only one, that rise up to deal with the challenge. Mine's more than their Institute. There are other groups that are small because we're new, because we've been mostly creating in the last 5 years or so to rise up to the challenge. I think you should look for us, find us. We're there. We're different breed because we're not bound by the same commitments that the legacy organizations have. The other thing is you can do some of this yourself. Even in it's not your congregation, you can't bring somebody at home. There might be a group of people in your congregation, find who they are. I call it the awkward dance. You find the people, I don't know about this. Find those people, in the shul that kind of ask around. And once you find them, those are your cohort. And then you can start reaching out to other Jews and other communities. And there's a lot of this that really has to be done at the ground level. And we tell this to parents, there's a lot of Jewish parents who are seeing what their kids are learning in school. And we say, look, you gotta, it's encourages contagious. Find other people like yourself, start with people you know. Look, who are the Asian American parents out there? Who might also, they might not look exactly like you, but they don't want their kids mad when school being closed. And their kids mad when school being closed for the exact same reason that Jewish kids are experiencing anti-Semitism. A group of radical ideologues are taking over the schools. And so those are our new friends that we haven't really gotten to know yet. And some of that is just really retail work. You just gotta find out who they are and do a lot of that work to build. We're going to do a lot of builders.
Dave, when you don't face the mic, we can't hear you very well.
Okay, I'm sorry. I will do that.
Now turn your body
I'll turn the body.
Ignore them.
I can't look at the person who asked me the question.
Ignore them.
but you're talking to all of us.
Thank you. You talked about following the money. It's kind of a picture, but you said it's not just following the money. That a lot of those things fall from. Can you explain? My understanding is most of it you find many, many years slowly in the academic world by places like that. So what's the homegrown part? What is that?
Yeah. So I talk of an ideology, a homegrown ideology. The ideology is around for a long, long time. It started as something called postmodernism. Now, the postmodernists were people who believed that knowledge was not something that you gained through critical inquiry or the scientific method. It was created by the powerful actors in society in order to hold down everybody else. And those ideas were relatively marginal up until about the late 1960s and early 1970s. When a group of radical students at the University of San Francisco started to put pressure on the university to create new departments called ethnic studies departments. And eventually the university folded. These weren't like other academic departments. They were studies of oppression. You didn't challenge the professor in those departments. You didn't read alternative views in those departments. It was ideological indoctrination. Now, within a few years, those studies departments spread to something like 1,300 colleges in the United States. And now they're pretty much everywhere in multiple versions. And now those studies departments have really taken over the humanities and social sciences in a lot of places. I'm not going to tell you it's everywhere to the same degree. You can still find an honest English professor, political scientist, sociologist, even not wrong with a few, anthropologists, and whatever, but the dominant stream is that ideology. And that's how it spread. Did money help? Yeah, but this was spreading irrespective of money. Did Qatar help? Yes, I don't know. But again, it was still finding its way to our institutions. That's why it was called by the people who were pushing it the long march through the institutions. And that's how we explain it. They were remarkably successful over a period of decades.
Outstanding discussion today. Thank you for your comments. Just amazing. It's my belief that it's my fear that if we don't solve the K-12 problem, K through 12,
Yeah.
that the country will become unlivable for our kids. Where do we start?
People will talk about it tomorrow in the class. K-12 education. I mean, I have to say, you're right. It is worse than you think. And I'm not the person who says it's worse than you think. I'm the person who says, there's some problem, don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. It is worse than you think. It is, please understand, if you're just looking for anti-Semitism, you'll find it, but it is much more insidious than that. A group of very, very radical people have taken over teachers' unions and are pushing this in teachers' unions. Remember how I told you about white supremacy culture that was like in schools? That is an official pedagogy of the National Education Association, the country's largest teachers' union. Go on the website, when I'm done, go look up white supremacy culture. Tina Oakley was the person who wrote this document. You'll see it, it's right there. And he is spreading it. It is entering the bloodstream of schools, especially schools in areas where we are most likely to have kids. I mean, yeah, you go to Birmingham and maybe it's not there, but there's not that many Jews in Birmingham. But it's not just about us. We're the canary in the coal mine. A group of ideologues are starting to spread this. And it starts before they actually get to the teachers' unions. It starts in the teachers' colleges. You can see that it's called decolonizing the curriculum. Now, I'm against colonization. It's not a good idea to go to another country and take over the people there and then, force them to bend to your will. That's ugly. But that's not what they mean by decolonizing. Very clever words. They mean stripping of all its Western influences. It's an attack on Western values. It's an attack on the ideas that I talked about that we take for granted. That this institution takes for granted, like open inquiry. It's an attack on those values. It's not teaching kids to be open and critical thinkers. It's teaching them the very opposite of being open and critical thinkers. And it's being taught in a lot of places. And when you go there and you go to talk to these schools about the problem, there's probably a few school board members who will just say, I'm sorry, but we consider that right-wing extremism. And they'll try to shut you down. I mean, they can be the most liberal in the world, but they don't want their kids to be indoctrinated. And when they raise that at the school board meeting, or they're raising the superintendent, they may be shut down. And we have to deal with this. I beg you to take this problem seriously. Because, as our friend here just said, it has gone very far, in very many places, and it's getting worse. Even if it's getting better, its ideology is on the house in the society at large, they're doubling down on it in K-12 institutions, and that's where our kids are being taught.